Yes, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Abdullah, and I will be chairing the first session, which is Robotics and Autonomy in the Sea, with Dr. Adil Akhtar. Our first speaker is Professor Michael Berumen. He's with the Red Sea Research Center, and he's going to give a talk on the future of coral reef monitoring. Professor Michael, the stage is yours.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you very much to the organizers, Eric, Shinku, and Raquel. Thanks for getting this awesome group of people together, and thanks for our session conveners, and especially thanks to those of you who've come from all over the world. So it's great to kick this off, and I think that the introduction from Gianluca and Eric have actually set the stage very nicely. I will talk about some of what I think will be very helpful. I'll give some examples of how I think that all of our disciplines can come together and help make a difference in the current future that we are going to have to face with coral reef monitoring. And so I am a professor of marine science, but I'm a biologist, just to be super clear. I'm not a robotics or AI person, but I am the director of the Red Sea Research Center, and so I want to acknowledge a few key people that have really influenced the information I'm saying here is by no means is it all my own ideas. So there's a few, the names that I've already mentioned with Raquel, Eric, and Shinku have been integral parts of this conversation over the past couple of years, but also Francesca Benzoni, who's another biologist, Bert Jones, who's speaking a bit later, and Bert is our oceanographer, but has a lot more vehicle and autonomous vehicle experience. And Khaled Salama is an electrical engineer that's done a lot with this as well. So anyway, there's a lot of people involved. I'll say more about that a bit later. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the Red Sea, if you haven't gotten a chance to get out in the water, I really encourage you to do so. There are some really beautiful coastal habitats such as seagrasses and mangroves. And the one that we'll spend some time talking about today I think the Red Sea is quite famous for its coral reefs. And so the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, I think just if you've not followed all the history, I mean, KAUST has been in operation more or less about 15 years. And in the last about 4 or 5 years, I feel like the kingdom has finally recognized that the coral reefs are really up there with its other amazing natural resources that need to be valued and protected and can be sustainably used. And so it's very exciting to be in Saudi right now because there are some enormous initiatives focused on bringing ecotourism into the kingdom as a new economy. And what's equally encouraging is that not only is there huge ambitions about developing that as a business model, but the statement is always upfront that it has to be done with the highest standards of conservation and protection of the environment. So it's not development at the expense of the environment. And in that process, the coral reefs are recognized as one of the key resources to utilize. And the investments are measured in I think it's fair to say, hundreds of billions of dollars that are going towards this. So it's really huge. There are several GigaProjects, as they're known here, because they're too big to be called mega projects. And so the GigaProjects, some of the ones that we interact with most closely include Red Sea Global. I'd be very surprised if you made it all the way to Saudi without ever hearing about NEOM. It's usually advertised at least on all the planes that come in here. So if you don't know these things, you should just do a quick Google and read about them. Amala is another one. But I put these three up here because these are the three that currently have the largest portfolios with coastal development, where they are expecting beautiful coral reefs to be a major part of what draws people to come. And a major part of the reason that they believe these are going to be attractive investments for people from all over the world. So as I mentioned, the goals are are very ambitious in terms of development, but they're also incredibly ambitious in terms of the commitment to preserve and in some cases, perhaps even enhance the condition of the reefs and the environment around them while they're building these projects. And so if you want to talk later about, how that all works and what all that's, I think, a super interesting conversation. One of the next talks in this session will be actually from one of the projects that KAUST is running in NEOM with an enormous coral reefscaping program, the largest in the world. And so that will give you some insight as to how you can do these, how these things are not mutually exclusive. Okay, but so what I wanted to focus on is the challenge that us as biologists and the people who work in the conservation space, and I don't know if Nick Pilcher made it in yet. So our colleague from the National Center for Wildlife that Jean-Luc mentioned, he'll be joining us. So the challenge that we have from this point of view of protection and understanding these systems is, how do you objectively check that? How do you measure whether the system at such a scale is being kept in good condition, or is it even potentially getting better? Collectively, those projects are covering hundreds, if not over 1,000 kilometers of coastline. And so it's an enormous job. And KAUST is, I'll explain KAUST's role in that. But let me see a show of hands. How many people in the room are biologists? See a few. And how many of you are familiar with corals as a like coral biology? Okay, a few. Okay, good. So I just want to explain a little bit to everyone else. So I got a challenge, a directive from Eric that what we are supposed to be doing is trying to help each other understand our challenges and our problems. And so I wanted to include a little bit about that to illustrate.
Yeah, you did ask how many of us are technologists.
How many of you are technologists? How many of you are engineers? How many of you are AI people? Okay. How many of you call yourselves a roboticist? Okay, good. Good. So this is a great balance. This is a great mix. And so I'll explain a little bit about why working with corals is a special type of challenge. This is a picture, and sorry if the quality of this image doesn't look that nice to you, look on the LCD screens at the side, they're a bit brighter. This is a picture of a reef from off in front of KAUST. They're very beautiful, colorful. Almost all the stuff that you see growing on the bottom that's not a fish, is a coral. And so, but it's actually a really challenging process to identify corals to the level of a species, or even maybe the level of a genus, and sometimes even a family can be challenging. Many corals look extremely similar, even to some of the professional coral biologists. Sometimes they look extremely similar, but different species may have very different ecologies, which means very different response to stress, very different tolerance for pollution or tolerance for heat. And so actually knowing which species occur in which place is very important, but it's a non-trivial challenge to identify them. And so among the problems are that some color is one of the first things that we always look for in our minds when we're trying to identify something. But all of these four things are exactly the same species with just very different colors. So color is not always helpful. And in fact, corals are really horrible animals to work with in this regard. Sometimes even the shape of the skeleton that they build may be very different within one species, and they may adapt that based on the environmental conditions. So it's very problematic for some of the groups to identify them. And in some cases, we actually have to get a tiny sample and sequence it in the molecular, we have to do the genetics to identify what a species is. And so this presents the first major challenge, is that reliable identification slows down most of our survey work to keep an eye on corals. Another major challenge is that individual colonies of coral can live to be several hundreds of years old. And some, like this especially enormous one, which is not in the Red Sea, but some like this one will certainly be more than 1,000 years old. They grow at extremely slow rates. A really fast growing coral might grow a couple of centimeters per year. Maybe there's a handful that might grow 3 or 4 centimeters per year, but most of them will grow in extension less than a centimeter per year. And so the challenge that that presents is that when we want to see, because of course, none of us, it's human nature that we want to see results and change much faster. And you can imagine that these GigaProjects, which hundreds of billions of dollars are being invested in, they want to see results tomorrow. And so when you're trying to improve, imagine if this room was full of corals and each of you is a coral and you're each growing just a few millimeters a year. Tracking that and measuring the difference from one time period to another is an extremely challenging thing to do. And so those are a couple of what we're going to need to do to make this whole effort a success. What we're going to need to do is measure extremely small changes over small periods of time, because that will be our best indication whether things are going in the right direction and the corals are growing, or whether they might be going in the wrong direction and corals can actually kind of shrink. They can actually get smaller if the conditions are bad. And so traditionally, when we survey coral reefs, we send divers out and they will drop a standardized frame onto, this is one of the methods, but we do some standardized measurements. This is a very common one where people will drop a frame and then take a photograph. And then later on their computer, they will assess what was inside that square, right inside that frame. Now, there are some very rudimentary software programs. It's so rudimentary that the most common way to do this is in Excel, just to let you know where the biologists usually stand in terms of our programming capabilities. So you probably can't see it unless you look on those screens, but you can have the program automatically provide you with random points across that space, and then you manually annotate each of those points, and that generates a set of statistics about what is there. And then you repeat this at many times and at many places. You can also take this image and then you can draw the two-dimensional area of a coral. And this is very commonly used if you're trying to follow something through time. But you can see that if the change that's happening is only a few millimeters a year, this process is going to be highly subject to error, especially if you're hand drawing those lines. And so this is really just a slow and rather inefficient process for the types of questions that we need to be asking now. And because corals are three-dimensional organisms, and working in a two-dimensional representation is often not ideal. There are some very interesting and quite good tools for using an AI system to annotate those images for you. It does require a fairly large training set from a specific region, but the most commonly used tool is called CoralNet, and it does a pretty good job at least getting to family. Sometimes they get to the genus level, and that has incredibly increased our workflow here in the Red Sea. So the next generation approach to doing this type of measurements, I'm going to borrow a video. Some of our colleagues are here from the Red Sea project, from Red Sea Global, and this is a survey that they did of one small area of reef. And this is using structure from motion. So it's using thousands of photographs to then reconstruct a three-dimensional mesh, which is extremely high resolution. And this is, in a sense, it's a digital twin of this little section of reef. And so once you have this as a digital tool, then you could start to ask questions at a much higher resolution about individual colonies. And it's at this resolution, which if you took the same image again a year from now, you might actually be able to detect whether those corals have grown a few millimeters or not. You could actually then query volumes of some of the structures. And I think this is really the way that we have to go in the future, because otherwise our reduced representation that we currently use doesn't give us the detail that we need. And so this does present a data challenge and a processing challenge, but I don't think those are solvable. I think that those can be resolved. So here's what it was just saying. If you can get that level of detail and repeat that through time, then you can start to ask questions that we really cannot effectively ask with our current approach. Things about species-specific growth rates, species-specific mortality rates. You can look for tiny little baby coral recruits in those images, and you can see how much those little baby corals survive, how fast they grow. You can look for larger scale structural change in the three-dimensional structure that we can't see capture in those two-dimensional images. And most importantly, this is where I think the early warnings of stress and impacts can be detected a little bit more efficiently. So currently, to take that image, it requires a diver or a couple of divers to swim around with several cameras and take thousands of photos. I do think that eventually it won't be a Remus, but I think eventually we could use some robotics to gather those images in an almost autonomous fashion. I put a couple of KAUST beacons on this reef, mini beacons out there. We could, if we know the areas we need to resurvey, we could have permanent beacons installed to help guide the robots around while they recollect those images on a fixed schedule. And if you're working with those types of vehicles, as many of you know, they are extremely customizable in terms of what types of sensors you could put in, what types of cameras and systems. There's a lot that we could do, but we've spent a lot of time picking Eric and Shinkyu's brains about how we build little robots that are competent and autonomous enough to navigate around these complex structures and measure all the little details that we want to measure at these scales, right next to the corals that we're trying to monitor. So I think that this is one hope, that maybe it's me, biologists, dreaming about what the future should be like, but I think that we should be able to automate that and not rely on people swimming around all the time to do it. But also to go back to our colleagues from the Red Sea Development Company, this is a map of their one of their project sites. This reef system that you see here, the structure of that lagoon is approximately 50 kilometers long, 50, 60 kilometers long. So it's a huge area. But each one of these points is one of the points on that reef that they're surveying. And so you can imagine in order to scale up and be able to repeat those surveys at hundreds of sites to get the kind of resolution that we would love to have, maybe you need vehicles that can autonomously run routes and do missions and go visit all these sites, because it takes them, I think it took almost a full, I'm looking at Luis, it took you almost a full year to do the first set of surveys manually, right? And that's not even processing the data, that's just going out and collecting data. So we need your help to to get the information at the scale that we need it in order to address the pace of the challenges and developments that are coming. So with all of these huge coastal developments, I see a couple of major challenges that exist right away. And this is the practical part that I think we have to worry about first. The first is that, and I didn't go into all the history, but the Red Sea is actually a very poorly studied system. Many of these projects are being done, many of these developments are being done at places where very little, if any, science has ever been done. So a lot of these sites we don't have good data for. We have not visited much. So we need to get a sufficient baseline of data at all of these sites, and we have to do that very quickly. So that's one of our immediate challenges. But then, as I said, we've got to find an innovative way to repeat high resolution monitoring to assess the impacts, whether it's positive or negative, right? So at this point in time, let's say, as KAUST, I think we take a fairly neutral stance with these projects. We are advisors, consultants, we're on boards. We're very much engaged with all of these huge development projects, but I think primarily as a science partner. And we're trying to give them the best information that we can so that they have the best chance to succeed. But whether or not it succeeds, I think we can also play an important role in providing an objective assessment of how that progress goes, of whether those developments do have the hoped for positive impact on the system, or whether there are negative impacts that may come. But in order to see those, in order to see corals and their biology changing subtly in a quick period of time, you need some more sensitive ways of monitoring than we currently use. Now, secondly, and this is where I think the marine scientists get excited about this, is where the coral biologists get excited about this. I think that what we can also do is at the same time, not only do all that high resolution monitoring, but we can improve the measurement of environmental parameters immediately in those systems as well. We currently rely on things like satellite imagery to tell us, broad patterns of temperature and broad patterns of productivity in ocean waters. And the resolutions of those are really insufficient to understand what's happening. Imagine if we could layer some of our reefs where we're watching individual corals grow over time. If we could have lots of unique sensors deployed at the scale of those corals, we could understand a much better picture about how the biology of the corals and the growth of the corals is interacting with the ecology of the reef. And so to that effect, so how do we get there? The Red Sea Research Center is a large collection of professors here in KAUST. This is all the different professors in our center. I'm obviously not going to go through them all, but if you have questions, we'd love to introduce you to all of them if we had time. But the top row is primarily our biologists and our biology experts. That is what the center's core expertise has been since the beginning of KAUST. So we're really a marine biology center. But in recent years, we have greatly expanded because the challenges that we have to address in terms of taking care of the Red Sea and oceans in general around the world, the challenges are no longer simple biology problems. And they're certainly not going to be solved by lowly biologists such as myself. We're going to really need input from people like yourself. And so we have intentionally expanded our scope to include a wide range of expertise. The second two rows of people, probably, I don't want to offend anybody, but probably did extremely little work in the ocean before they came to KAUST and before we started working very hard to convince them that there were very interesting applications for their skills to help us solve some of the underwater challenges. And so the group I wanted to highlight today is the people circled in red are people who are working closely with us on an initiative that we are referring to as the Smart Reef initiative. And so you can see that we've got sensors and electronics people, we have robotics people, we've got AI people, we've got a whole suite of people that we're trying to get to speak to each other. And it's been a lot of fun trying to help improve the communication so that we all understand what we need to do. And this is just a simple schematic of something that's in early pilot stages on a reef in front of KAUST, where we would like to instrument and automate and deploy all types of tools so that we can really get that high resolution picture of the combination of environment and biology, the ecological response, the growth of corals, but also as a test bed for all of the people developing really fun instruments and sensors and robots here at KAUST. And I think later this week, we'll hear from Raquel about Coral Probiotics Village, I assume, right? Which is we would now say it's one neighborhood in the Smart Reef. So it's a really, I think, a really exciting and interesting collaborative effort that we're trying to take to get this to pull everyone together there. So this was the last slide that I worked on for Eric's, following Eric's instructions. But to just sort of think a little bit broadly about where the rest, where you all can help us biologists. As I mentioned, some parts of this process have some semi-automation already using things like CoralNet, and the structure for motion assembly itself is fairly straightforward. But a lot of them could be improved, and they could probably be made more efficient and maybe even a little bit more autonomous in terms of feeding in our data to it. Identification of corals is always going to be a difficult challenge, and they can probably be a little bit refined. I haven't yet played much with segment anything, but people tell me there's some promise that maybe it will help us be quicker in segmenting our images of reefs, especially for 3D imagery. Bram was presenting to us last week, right? It was last week about his project where, and this is a problem he pointed out, that segmentation and annotation are okay for two-dimensional images, but we have yet to have simple solutions to do that in three-dimensional space. So hopefully we can find a way forward there. Doing that temporal reanalysis. So, whether it's every 6 months or 12 months, how finding ways to really automate that, repeated surveys and making sure that we can line up our surveys in the right places correctly, I think are going to be really important. And then if we get to the scale of something like Smart Reef, where we have tons of real-time data flowing in with all kinds of environmental parameters, automating those data streams, I think will be really an interesting possibility, because what it could do is it could potentially give us early warning systems where we have lots of sensors spread out over the sea, and we can't possibly deploy all our resources to all the places all the time. But if we could get some early warning that a stress event might be coming, or that there might be some kind of anomalous environmental action, then we could respond to that much more efficiently than we do today. And so yeah, it sounds simple to say, yeah, we could just build some robots that could do a lot of this for us. And then I get Eric and Shinku beating me over the head all the time, reminding me that it's a huge job to do that. And so anyway, I think this is just a teaser of some of the things that we could probably do. I'd love to see something like this dashboard type of system where we all have apps on our phone that tell us what the health of any given reef is on any given day. And we could get alerts, just like we get a bad air quality alert, or we get a heat or a rainstorm alert, that type of thing. I think that we should be able to, that will help us respond in the cases that we can intervene, and take good care of our reefs out there. So anyway, I'll leave it there and say thanks very much. I hope that we have time for a few questions or comments, and I hope you guys enjoy the rest of the meeting. So thank you.